Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Hadith 414 about the Tahiyatul Masjid when the Imam is giving the khutbah. From Jabir ibn Abdullah, he says a man called Sulaik al-Ghatafani came to the masjid whilst the Prophet was giving the khutbah, and this man sat down. The Prophet said to him, Ya Sulaik, Qum farka' raka'ataini wa tajawwaz fihima. O Sulaik, stand up and pray the 2 rak'at and make them succinct. And then the Prophet said, إذا جاء أحدكم يوم الجمعة والإمام يخطب فليركع ركعتين وليتجوز فيهما. When one of you comes to the masjid on Yawm al-Jum'ah and the Imam is giving the khutbah, then let him pray 2 short rak'at. We know from other narrations in the chapter that the Prophet asked him first, have you prayed 2 rak'at? And when he said no, then the Prophet told him, stand up and pray the 2 rak'at. So from this we learn an important lesson that if you're going to enjoin the good and forbid the evil, make sure that the person you're going to advise has actually done something wrong. So you need to make sure of that first before you give the admonition. Some scholars have said that if this happens to you, that the Imam is giving the khutbah and you enter the masjid, then you do not pray the Tahiyatul Masjid, rather you listen to the Imam because that is wajib. However, this opinion is batil. It completely opposes this hadith. This hadith is used by those scholars who say that the Tahiyatul Masjid is wajib. How is this? Well, because listening to the khutbah is wajib, and this could not be counteracted except with something else which is similarly wajib, not just merely mustahab. So if that is understood, then it becomes understood that the Tahiyatul Masjid is wajib. And this is a strong opinion, and the Tahiyatul Masjid should not be left out. So when you enter the masjid, you must pray the Tahiyatul Masjid. If you leave the masjid for a short while, and you come back in, then you do not need to repeat the Tahiyatul Masjid, as long as you've just left the masjid for a very short period of time. But generally, the rule is whenever you enter the masjid, before you sit down, you pray the Tahiyatul Masjid. If you are just going to pass through the masjid, or going to enter the masjid and go back out without sitting down, then you don't need to perform the Tahiyyah. We can also take from the narration that the Imam is allowed to speak to a member of the congregation in a time of need, just as the Prophet did here. Also, we know from the hadith that if you enter the masjid and you sit down without performing the Tahiyyah, because maybe you forgot. Now if you remember after a short time, let's say about a minute or 2, then you get up and pray it. If you remember after a long time, then the time for this prayer has passed you by, and you have missed it. Likewise, if somebody is ignorant, if he sits down, you tell him to pray the Tahiyatul Masjid, as long as it is just after a short time of him sitting down. Hadith 415, about teaching somebody in particular of the deen during the khutbah. From Abu Rifa'ah, he says, he came to the Prophet whilst the Prophet was giving the khutbah, and he said to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, a man who is from outside the city, he has come to ask you about his deen, because he does not know about his deen. This man, of course, Abu Rifa'ah, speaking about himself. So he says that the Prophet stopped the khutbah, he came to Abu Rifa'ah, and a seat was brought. He says, I thought the legs of the seat were made of iron, and the Prophet sat down on this seat, and started teaching the man about his deen, which Allah has taught the Prophet. Then the Prophet recommenced his khutbah and completed it. So from here we can take what we already know, that a man from the congregation can address the Imam for a particular need, and that the Imam can address a particular member of the congregation for a particular need as well. Hadith 416, about what is recited in the Surat Al-Jummah. From Ibn Abi Rafi', he says Abu Hurairah came to Mecca and prayed the Surat Al-Jummah. He led the prayer. In the first rak'ah, he recited Surat Al-Jum'ah. In the second one, Surat Al-Munafiqun. And he says, I asked Abu Hurairah about this. I said to him that you recited the same as Ali ibn Abi Talib would recite in Al-Kufa. And Abu Hurairah says, I heard the Prophet recite these surahs on Yawm al-Jum'ah. And another hadith in the same chapter, from An-Nu'man ibn Bishr, he says the Prophet used to recite in the Salaah of the Eid and on Yawm al-Jum'ah, Surat Al-A'la and Surat Al-Ghashiyah. So from these narrations we find that these surah are recommended to be recited. So the relevance of Surat Al-Jum'ah is that in this surah there is the order to attend listening to the khutbah and the salah. And also it has many other good preaching in it. For example, it talks about the Yahud who did not follow the Torah. They are like donkeys carrying books. Such beneficial books they have, but they understand nothing of it, just like a donkey. And so the same rule applies to the Muslims if they do not implement the Quran. As for the Surah Al-Munafiqeen, then it talks about the Munafiqun, of course. And in this big congregation, there may well be some Munafiqeen. So it is really talking about them and admonishing them to make tawbah. from their nifaq. And then besides this, it has much other valuable admonition, for example, giving charity before death reaches you, and then you would regret being stingy. As for Surat Al-A'la, then it also mentions the one who remembers his Lord, makes a dhikr and prays. So the dhikr is the khutbah and the prayer is the Salat al-Jummah. So you can see the relevance there, as well as having many other useful reminders in this surah. Surat Al-Ghashiyah talks primarily about Yawm al-Qiyamah. The relevance here is that Yawm al-Qiyamah will be established on a Friday, and it talks about how some faces will be bright and happy and other faces will be weary and tired. And so this is clearly useful admonition. Hadith 417 from Ibn Abbas, he says the Prophet used to recite in the Salat al-Fajr, this is the Fard prayer, on Yawm al-Jum'ah, Alif Lam Mim Tanzil al-Sajdah, this is Surat al-Sajdah, and in the second raka'ah, Hal Ata ala al-Insani Hinum min al-Dahr, this is Surat al-Insan, and that he would recite in the Salat al-Jum'ah, Surat al-Jum'ah and al-Munafiqeen. Well, the new information we learn here is that in the Salat al-Subh on Yawm al-Jum'ah, these two surahs are recommended to be recited. So what's the relevance of Surah Al-Sajdah? This surah talks about the creation of Adam alayhi salam, as it says, وَبَدَأَ خَلْقَ الْإِنسَانِ مِنْ طِينٍ, and he began the creation of insan from teen, which is mud. And we know that Adam alayhi salam was created during the last part of Friday. Also we know that Yawm al-Qiyamah will be established on Friday, and this surah speaks much about Yawm al-Qiyamah. It speaks much about the fire and how the kuffar will regret their kufr. وَلَوْ تَرَى إِذِ الْمُجْرِمُونَ نَاكِسُوا رُؤُوسِهِمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ رَبَّنَا أَبْصَرْنَا وَسَمِعْنَا فَارْجِعْنَا نَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا إِنَّا مُوقِنُونَ. And if only you could see the wrongdoers hanging their heads down before their Lord, saying, Our Lord, we have seen and we have heard, so send us back to the world that we may do some righteous deeds. Verily now we will believe with certainty. But on the other hand, it also talks about the pleasure of the believers, as in a statement, أَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ فَلَهُمْ جَنَّاتُ الْمَأْوَى نُزُلًا بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And as for those who believe and work righteousness, for them there will be gardens to abide therein, as an entertainment for what they used to work. And it talks about the day of reckoning, which will of course be established on Yawm al-Jum'ah. وَيَقُولُونَ مَتَى هَذَا الْفَتْحُ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And these kuffar say, when is this fath, or this decision, meaning the Yawm al-Qiyamah, when is this decision between you and us if you are telling the truth? قُلْ يَوْمَ الْفَتْحِ لَا يَنْفَعُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِيمَانُهُمْ وَلَا هُمْ يُنظَرُونَ. Say on that day, if the disbelievers were to believe, it would not profit them, and neither shall they be given any respite. فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ وَانْتَظِرْ إِنَّهُمْ مُنْتَظِرُونَ. So turn aside from them and await. Verily, they too are waiting. What about Surah Al-Insan? This surah is heavily skewed towards mentioning Jannah and the delights therein. In fact, only one of its 31 ayat speaks about Jahannam. But the majority of the surah speaks much about the description of Jannah. It's extremely uplifting, and it appears this is the purpose of the surah, to be uplifting. And because Yawm al-Qiyamah will be established on Yawm al-Jum'ah, the believers will enter Jannah. And so this appears to be the relevance. But anyway, the ruling on reciting this surah is that it is recommended and not wajib, as the Prophet did not give a verbal order to recite this surah on Yawm al-Jum'ah. Hadith 418, making the Sunnah prayer after the Salat al-Jum'ah. From Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, إِذَا صَلَّ أَحَدُكُمُ الْجُمْعَةَ فَلْيُصَلِّ بَعْدَهَا أَرْبَعًا. When one of you prays the Jum'ah, then let him pray 4 raka'at after it. Before Salat al-Jum'ah, you can pray as many Sunnah as you can. And we have discussed the evidence for that previously, about the one who takes a bath and he comes to the Yawm al-Jum'ah, prays whatever has been decreed for him to pray. And then he listens to the Imam until he finishes and prays with him. Then his sins between the Jum'ah are forgiven and an extra 3 days. But when it comes to after the Salat al-Jum'ah, then 4 rak'at are legislated. Also in the chapter, Nafi' reports that Abdullah ibn Umar, when he would pray the Salat al-Jum'ah, he would go back to his house and pray 2 rak'at, and he would say that the Prophet used to do this. We could combine between the narrations and say that if you're going to pray in the masjid, make it 4. If you're going to go home, make it 2. Or we could simply say that it is 4 wherever you pray it, but sometimes you can pray 2 as well, so that you have a choice of 4 or 2. Some scholars said that you pray 4 and 2, so 4 in the masjid, 2 when you go home. But praying 6 sunan after the prayer or even before the prayer, we don't really have anything similar to that in the Sharia. So it appears the better opinion would be that you pray 4, and this should be your usual practice, but if you want to pray 2, then this is also acceptable. Also in the chapter, from As-Sa'ib, he said, I prayed the Salatul Jummah. When the Imam said the Salam, I got up to pray the Sunnah. And afterwards, Muawiyah told him, do not do what you just did. When you have prayed the Salatul Jummah, then do not immediately join it on to another Salah, the Sunnah, until you have spoken something else or have left the place of your Fard prayer. He says that the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to do this. In other words, that we should not join a Salah to another Salah until we have spoken in between or have left our place. The narration here mentions that As-Sa'ib prayed the Jumu'ah in a maqsura, which is a separate room. And so there's a difference of opinion here. Should the Jumu'ah be prayed in a room like this or not? Some of the early Muslim scholars have allowed it, some have not. So this maqsura would be a room within the masjid. And so some scholars have said that this is permissible as long as it is open to the public, so anyone can enter it, but not permissible if it's just specifically for one person. However, it should be noted that the reason why Muawiyah radiallahu anh prayed in this maqsura is because there was a fear that some evil people may try to harm him in the salah. And so this is why if the ruler has this fear, he may use the maqsura. But to say that it is open to everyone would defeat the purpose of the maqsura, which is to protect the ruler or any particular individual who is being targeted by the Khawarij or people of evil like that. And we can also take from this narration that when it comes to the Fard prayer and the Sunnah prayers, you should not join them on. Rather, you should move from your place from which you prayed the Fard and pray in a different place, so as to draw a clear distinction between the Fard and the Sunnah. The distinction can also be by speaking in between, and so that is okay, but it is better to draw the distinction between the two prayers by moving places. Then Imam Muslim says, Kitab Salat al-Udain, the book of the Two Eid Prayers, Hadith 417, from Jabir ibn Abdullah. He says the Prophet stood up on the Yawm al-Fitr, this is the Eid al-Fitr, and he began with the prayer before the khutbah, and then he gave the khutbah. Then when he finished the khutbah, he came down and he went to the women and he gave them a reminder. And he was leaning against Bilal radiallahu anh, and Bilal had laid down a mat or a cloth on which the women were giving the charity. We take from this narration and others in the chapter that the khutbah is given after the Salat al-Eid, which opposes the situation of Yawm al-Jumu'ah in which the khutbah must precede the Salah, and that's because the khutbah is a condition for the Salah to be correct on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, but not so for the Salat al-Eid. Not just that, the khutbah on Yawm al-Jumu'ah is wajib and a condition, but the khutbah on Yawm al-Eid, the Imam should give it for those who are present. However, it is not wajib to listen to it, whereas the Yawm al-Jumu'ah khutbah is wajib to be listened to. The evidence that it is not wajib to listen to the khutbah of Eid is the authentic hadith in the Sunnah in which the Prophet said, إِنَّا نَخْطُبُ فَمَنْ شَاءَ أَنْ يَجْلِسَ فَلْيَجْلِسْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ أَنْ يَذْهَبَ فَلْيَذْهَبْ. We are giving the khutbah, so whoever wants to sit down, let him sit, and whoever wants to go, let him go. What is the ruling on the Salat al-Eid? Well, the correct opinion, and the one which is supported best by the evidence, is that it is fardu ayn on all the men, just like any Salat al-Jama'ah. It is mustahab for the women, because the Prophet even ordered the women to come out, even the ones who are menstruating, and even the younger ones who are unmarried, who don't normally come out of the homes. He ordered them to come out as well, so everybody can enjoy the occasion and have a real community and family atmosphere. That's the whole point about the Eid. And we know from this narration that the women were present for the Salat al-Eid because he came and he gave them a separate khutbah. So is it permissible then for a man to be addressing women? Well, what we say is that there is no objection to a man addressing women. However, if he has women sitting in front of him and he can look directly at them, then this is impermissible because of the real perceived fitna. So there should be some type of separation. You can easily address them. It is true that in this narration, we don't think that there would have been any separation between the Prophet and the women, but nowadays, it is always safer to have separation to be safe from the fitna. And there is no harm in having the separation. If anything, there would be harm when there is no separation. You should notice that this is not a second khutbah which is giving like the Salat Al-Jummah. You have the khutbah in two parts. Rather, the Prophet only gave one khutbah during the Salat Al-Eid. This separate khutbah was something specific for the women. It is probable that the women may not have heard his normal khutbah delivered to the men. But in any case, this is a specific address he gave to the women. How is the Salat Al-Eid performed? Well, in Sahih Muslim we do not find any detailed explanation. But in the Sunnah we do find the explanation of how the Eid is performed. It is simply a 2 rak'ah prayer with extra takbirat. In the first rak'ah, you would make the Takbiratul Ihram, and then you can make the Dua al-Istiftah. Then after that you will perform 6 more takbirat, thus making 7 in total. And then you recite the Fatiha and the Surah. Then you will complete the rak'ah as normal. Then you will make the takbir and come back up for the second rak'ah. Then when in the standing position, you will make 5 more takbirat, and then begin the Fatiha with the Surah and complete the rest of the prayer as normal. If you did not perform the extra takbirat, the prayer is still valid, because the extra takbirat are sunnah. Do you raise the hands with the takbirat? Well, we don't have any authentic evidence for this, but it's just that from Ibn Umar it has been narrated that he would raise his hands. Well, if that is authentic, then we can take from it, and others will not raise their hands because there's nothing authentic from the Prophet. And there is nothing legislated to be said in between the takbirat either, or nothing authentically legislated. We find in another narration of the chapter that the women would throw their rings and their earrings on the mat giving charity, so we can take that the woman is allowed to give sadaqah without the permission of her husband, because this is her wealth and she can do with it as she wants to. As for the hadith which says that it is not permissible for a woman to do as she wants with her wealth except with the permission of her husband, then we can say that this applies to the woman who does not know how to deal with her wealth properly. Because normally women don't deal with wealth. They're not normally business women, or at least in those days it would not have been like that. Men are normally the ones who know how to deal with wealth properly. So if the woman is such that she does not know how to deal with the wealth properly, then yes, she should take permission from her husband first, because we don't want to be responsible for wasting wealth. But as for if she does know how to deal with her wealth, then we have plenty of evidences, and this being one of them, that the woman can do with her wealth as she wants to, as long as it's not haram. Hadith 418, that the adhan and the iqamah are not given for the Salat al-Eid. From Jabir ibn Samurah, he says, I prayed with the Prophet the Salat al-Udain on more than one occasion, and he prayed it without the adhan nor the iqamah. So what we can take from this narration is fairly obvious, that the Salat al-Udain are not prayed with the adhan nor iqamah, and this is because there is no need. Everybody is gathered, they all know when the Salat al-Eid is. There's not really any need for the adhan nor iqamah. All that happens is that the people are sitting down, the imam comes in, he takes to the front, and simply everybody stands up and he makes the takbir and leads the prayer. Then afterwards he will give the khutbah. 419, from Ibn Umar, he says that the Prophet and Abu Bakr and Umar used to pray the Udain before the khutbah. The Salat al-Udain is normally prayed out in the open because it is an emblem of Islam, so it's an open display of this ritual of Islam. It is permissible to be prayed in the masjid if it's raining, for example, or if you're in a place in which it is difficult to go outside, out in the open somewhere, then you can pray it in the masjid, but it is not meant to be prayed in the masjid. Rather, it is meant to be prayed in the musalla of the Eid, in the prayer place of the Eid, which is out in the open. Hadith 420, about women coming out to the Salat al-Eid, from Atiyah. She says that the Prophet ordered us to come out for the Eid al-Fitr and the Adha, and also the Awatiq, who are the young girls between the age of puberty and marriage, and also women who were behind the curtain, so these are the young girls who remain in their homes and they don't leave because they're not married yet. He ordered all of these to come out, but the menstruating women will keep away from the musalla, or the prayer place of the Eid, but they will all witness the goodness and the dua of the Muslimin. Atiyah says, O Messenger of Allah, one of us does not have a jilbab to wear. The Prophet replied, لِتُلْبِسْهَا أُخْتُهَا مِنْ جِلْبَابِهَا. Then let her sister give her a jilbab to wear. So we can take from this that even the women, and even those women who don't normally leave the home, they are ordered to come out as well. And it is mustahab for women to come out for the Salat al-Eid. We cannot say it is wajib. But if the Prophet ordered these types of women to come out, then it is without doubt obligatory upon the men to attend the Salat al-Eid, and the Salat al-Eid cannot be prayed at home. There are many scholars who say that if you are unable to pray it in the masjid, then you can do it at home, for example if you're ill. But the weightier opinion here is that the Salat al-Eid is very much like the Salat al-Jummah. You cannot perform it individually in your own home. It must necessarily be done with the congregation, and if you missed it, then there's no way you can make up for it. So the Salat al-Eid is very similar to the Salat al-Jummah. If you want to pray it, you're going to necessarily have to come out and join the congregation. We can also take from the narration the state of affairs of some of the Sahaba. She says that one of us does not even have a jilbab. Can you imagine this? Women nowadays, they have wardrobes full of clothes. And back in those days, a woman did not even have a jilbab to go out in. Of course, the Eid time has its takbir, which is to say Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, walillahi alhamd. This is one version. You could find some slight variations which have been reported by the companions, and all of it is fine. But this is to be said when Ramadan finishes, up until the Salatul Eid al-Fitr, and when it comes to the Eid al-Adha, then in the first 10 days it should be said at any particular time, and then on Yawm Arafah, then the takbir is to be said after every fard prayer, up until the end of the days of Tashriq, so that would be up until and including Salat al-Asr on the 13th. And even in these days of Tashriq, you can make the takbir much, even in between the prayers. These days of Tashriq, the 11th, 12th and 13th, are days for takbir, the remembrance of Allah, and eating and drinking, but not fasting, because this is not permissible during the days of Eid, and the days of Tashriq are also days of Eid. Hadith 421, leaving off the prayer before and after the Eid. From Ibn Abbas, he says the Prophet came out for the Salat al-Duha, or the Fitr, and he prayed 2 rak'at, and he did not pray before nor after it. And then he went to the women with Bilal, and he ordered them to give the sadaqah, and so the woman would begin to throw her jewelry as she gave it in charity. So the point with this narration is that there is no prayer before and after the Salat al-Eid, so there's no ratib sunnah. However, is the musalla of Eid to be treated as a masjid? It appears that you can treat it as a masjid, because we find that the menstruating women were forbidden from entering onto the musalla of the Eid, which would suggest to us that this is like a masjid, because we know menstruating women are not allowed to come into the masjid and stay there. So if that is the case, then we could justify praying the Tahiyatul Masjid before you sit down on the musalla of the Eid. Of course, the Prophet did not need to pray the Tahiyatul Masjid, because he's going to immediately come to the musalla and begin with the Salatul Eid. But as for the other members of the congregation, the Tahiyatul Masjid would apply to them. Likewise, if the Eid prayer is being taken place in a masjid, a normal masjid, then yes, you would do the Tahiyatul Masjid before you sit down. Hadith 422, about what is recited in the Udain. Umar ibn al-Khattab says the Prophet recited on the Yawm al-Eid, اقتربت الساعة, which is Surat Al-Qamar, and in the second rak'ah, Qaf wal-Qur'an al-Majid. This is Surat Qaf. So these are 2 recommended surah to be recited during the Salat al-Eid. In fact, there are another couple of recommended surah that can be recited, which are the same as the Yawm al-Jummah. In the first rak'ah, Surat Al-A'la, and in the second one, Surat Al-Ghashiyah. So the Imam has a choice. Otherwise, you can recite any portion of the Quran, it is all valid. But these surah are by way of recommendation. Hadith 422, playing and activities to distract yourself during the Eid, as long as there's no disobedience in them, then this is perfectly permissible. From Aisha, she says that Abu Bakr entered into my home, and with me there were 2 young girls from the Ansar. They were both singing about a particular day in which the Aus and the Khazraj had a war during the days of the Jahiliyyah. So the song was pertaining to that particular day. And she says that these 2 girls are not singers, meaning they are not usual or regular singers, like pop singers that you see. And Abu Bakr says, أبمزمور الشيطان في بيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The muzmur means a voice, or a singing, or a melodious voice. So he says that this melodious voice in the house of the Messenger of Allah, meaning to say, how dare you? And Abu Bakr said, and all of this on the day of Eid? So to that the Prophet replied, Ya Abu Bakr, إِنَّ لِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ عِيدًا وَهَذَا عِيدُنَا. O Abu Bakr, every nation has its festival, and this is our festival. In another narration, it says that these two girls were playing with the duf, which is a one-sided drum. So it appears they were singing and playing with a one-sided drum. And the lyrics about which they were singing were not in praise of the matters of Jahiliyyah, rather they were about bravery and war. We can take from this that Abu Bakr understood that this idea of playing with the duf and singing is not to be done, it's not fitting for the Muslim lifestyle. And generally this is the case, because notice the Prophet ﷺ did not tell Abu Bakr that he's wrong when he said, Abi muzmur al-shaytani fi bayti Rasulillah, the melodious voice of the shaitan in the house of the Messenger of Allah, and on Eid as well. Rather, the Prophet corrected Abu Bakr in saying that this singing with the duf is permissible on the day of Eid. But he did not tell Abu Bakr that, no, Abu Bakr, you're wrong, playing with the duf and singing is halal, just as drinking water is always halal. So we can say that the usual practice needs to be that playing with the duf and singing is not to be done, as it is not fitting for the Muslim lifestyle. But on Eid we can make the exception and relax this ruling. Notice also that Aisha says that these two girls were not singers, so they are not normally singing, because a singer is somebody who sings as a means of earning his or her living. So he's always singing. She says that these girls were not always singing, so this was a one-off occasion. So we find that singing for women and playing the duf is permissible then on certain happy occasions. So we know that this Eid is one such an occasion. The Prophet also mentioned marriage to be an occasion in which you can sing. He said, Al-Fasl bayn al-halali wal-haram, as-sawtu wal-duf. The separation between the halal and the haram type of marriage is the sawt, which is the voice, meaning singing, and the duf, which is the one-sided drum. Notice it's a one-sided drum and not a double-sided drum, because a one-sided drum makes much less of a melodious sound, so the fitna is less. This narration cannot be used as evidence to say that musical instruments are halal, because we have particular evidence to tell us that musical instruments are not halal, such as the Prophet saying that there will be a group of my ummah seeking to make lawful wearing silk and zina and khamr and ma'azif, which are musical instruments. So this is the general rule, that these things are all haram, because you cannot seek to make lawful that which is already lawful. So from this general rule, we will just take out the exception that on the Eid, the women can sing and play the duf as well. Also on momentous occasions, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ came to Al-Madinah safe and sound, a woman said to him that I made a nadhr or a vow that if you come to Al-Madinah safe and sound, I will play the duf and sing. And the Prophet said, look, if you have made a nadhr, then do it and fulfill it, carry it out, otherwise don't. So it is permissible on these momentous occasions as well. For example, news comes in that the Muslim army has conquered a particular land. There's no problem in celebrating this and playing the duf and singing about it. Men ought not to sing because it's effeminate. However, even for men, singing can be permissible during certain times. For example, singing a lullaby to his child to put him to sleep. This is permissible because we can just relax the ruling here. It is not like he's singing on stage or anything. It is just a private affair, so that's fine. Also, we have particular evidence of a man called Anjasha. He used to drive the camels on by singing because the camels would respond to the singing voice, and so they would walk faster. So this companion Anjasha used to drive the camels on using the singing. In Arabic this is called huda, and the Prophet ﷺ acknowledged this. But for a man to be a regular singer, like a conventional singer, then this is not permissible because it is effeminate and it is not befitting the character of a Muslim man who fears Allah Jalla wa Ala. Hadith 422 from Aisha, she says, I saw the Prophet standing at the door of his room, and some people from Al-Habasha, present-day Ethiopia, were playing with their spears in the masjid of the Prophet. And she says I was looking as well, and he would be covering me with his rida. So Aisha was looking at them play, but they could not see Aisha because she was covered. And she says he covered me until I walked away. And so Aisha says, just realize then how eager a young girl is when it comes to these entertainment issues and issues of distraction. Now, this narration runs parallel to the narration before about the two young girls singing with the duf, in that the rules can be relaxed on the day of Eid. So singing and playing with the duf, for example, normally should not be done, but on Eid the rules are relaxed. Similarly, playing in the masjid of the Prophet with your spears, should this normally be done? Well, of course not. The masjid is not a place for any play activity. But on the day of Eid we can relax these rulings. Otherwise, the day of Eid would be no different to the other days. And from this we can take that a woman can look at a non-mahram man if it is not with desire. But if it is with desire, then Allah Jalla wa Ala does say in the Quran, وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغْضُضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنْ, and say to the believing women to lower their gaze. So the order applies to women as well as to men. But of course it is far more strict for men, because men are visually stimulated far more easily than women. Some scholars would say that women are not allowed to look at men, full stop, just like men are not allowed to look at a non-mahram woman. And they say that Aisha was looking at these men because she was young, she was not baligh yet, and so it's not really a problem. And they say that women are not allowed to look at men, and they take the evidence, the hadith in Sunan at-Tirmidhi, where the Prophet ordered his wives Salama and Habiba to take cover from Ibn Maktoum. And they said, but Ibn Maktoum is blind, he cannot see us. Why do we need to make the hijab and take cover from him? And the Prophet told them, but are you two also blind that you cannot see? So in other words, you are not allowed to see him, even if he cannot see you. This hadith has been graded to be weak, but in any case, we can arrive at a middle ground. We can say that if the woman fears some sort of fitna, then she has to lower her gaze, because the ayah of the Quran is very clear-cut, and say to the believing women to lower their gaze. Now this does not have two interpretations. The interpretation is one: lower your gaze, simple. Also, we can take an important lesson from what Aisha said. She said, look at a young girl, how eager she is to look at this entertainment and distraction issues. So anyone who is a parent and has young daughters and sons should know that they would be eager for entertainment and distraction. Why is this important? Well, because you don't want your children to be taking their entertainment and distraction from the evil and licentious kuffar, because it will only be a matter of time that they will take them as role models and be infatuated by them. So it is upon the Muslim parent to provide their children with halal alternative, and they should know that you cannot fight the nature of the children. They will be attracted to entertainment and playing and distracting themselves. That's just their nature. It is for this reason that we can allow images of dolls and play figures, let's say, for the children, whereas otherwise it would not be permissible. Angels don't enter a house in which there is an image of a human or animal face, nor where there is a dog, nor a bell. But we can relax the ruling for children, and this is because it's in their nature to be distracted and to be playful. But the point here is that the Muslim parent must provide halal entertainment for the children, so that they are not infatuated by the evil and shameless kuffar. And in the chapter from Abu Hurairah, he says that whilst the Habasha people were playing in the masjid of the Prophet, in came Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he reached out for some stones to throw it at them, and the Prophet said to him, Da'hum ya Umar, leave them, O Umar. Again, this narration is similar to what Abu Bakr did. He comes in the house of the Prophet and he sees these two girls singing, and he rebukes them. Now Umar was going to stone these people because they're simply playing in the masjid of the Prophet with their spears, some sort of war game or the like. Now normally this is not to be done. That's why Umar reached for the stones to throw it at them, because this was the norm, just like it is the norm not to be playing with the duf and singing. This is often the issue which many people miss here. But because it is Eid, the Prophet forbade Abu Bakr in that previous narration from rebuking the girls, and in this narration now he forbade Umar from punishing or rebuking these Habasha, because it is the day of Eid and the rules can be slightly relaxed, because otherwise the day of Eid would be no different to other days, which would mean that the Eid would lose its festival spirit. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What evidence is used to prove that Tahiyatul Masjid is wajib? Question number 2. What is the description of the Salatul Eid? Question number 3. Why is there no adhan nor iqama during the Salatul Eid?